Thank you, Vitaly, and thank you, everybody. Yeah, my name's Elliot, as you can probably tell from the very large lettering on there. I've got this up because this is a logo that I commissioned from a friend of mine recently called Evolution, who made me this lovely logo, and I have these lovely neon orange business cards. So if anyone wants one afterwards, come and chat to me, and I may just force some upon you anyway. Before we get started, I should probably explain. I've got this kind of sort of weird temporary tattoo. About 2 days ago, my oldest daughter, assured me that if she put a temporary tattoo on me, that it would definitely come off really, really easily. It hasn't come off really easily, so just in case anyone's wondering. But luckily, she was correct in saying that the face paint did wash off easily, because this was me just before I left for Freiburg. I was getting a little bit nervous. I feel like the tone of the talk might have been a little bit different had I turned up in full face paint. Better type for the web. 10 years ago, actually, I think pretty much 10 years ago to the day, I got my little Google photo frame telling me that 10 years ago I was in Freiburg. I think like almost exactly the same dates. I was here on this stage speaking about web typography, still going on about it. But it's interesting because in the last 10 years, in a way, a lot has changed. And in a way, not much has changed. So I was talking a lot at that time about open type support in browsers and things like that. But really, as Vitaly said, we're in a very everything's much healthier shape. It's much more about refinement now. Now, in a way, that's quite interesting because when you think about web design as a whole, we don't really have folks sort of coming up on stage and saying, hey, this is a cool new way to design a website. Like, we've kind of established the foundations. It's much more a sense of improving what we've got and refining. And in a way, we're totally the same with web typography. And actually, when you think about it, typography as a whole is kind of like that. We have these great defaults, especially when we're dealing with digital design and with web typography. And it's much more, I feel like our responsibility as folks working on the web is to take those defaults and then just refine them and to spend our time and our effort making things as good as they possibly can be. So today I'm going to focus on 6 areas because web typography is pretty massive subject, and I don't have long, and I'm probably going to get dragged off stage by Vitaly anyway. But I'm going to talk about OpenType because that's still a thing, optical size, grade, variable fonts, and how optical size and grade play into that. Some woes around line height, a lot of the challenges there, and fluid type scales. So I'm going to try and blast through all of them. If I don't get through them all, or I start to kind of spend a little bit too long on one of them, and you want to talk about it a little bit more, please feel free to come and grab me afterwards, over a beer or whatever. I'm happy to nerd out about all of this stuff. So about 10 years ago, I was here, and just over 10 years ago, I think, was it 11 years ago? I had just worked with Vitaly and the Smashing team on redesigning the previous version of Smashing Magazine, which was lots of fun. So just to give you a quick background, I'm not going to show loads and loads of my work, but just the more sort of type-centric stuff. I was a web designer for many years, and in about 2010, when web design was kind of growing up and typography was becoming sort of more on web designers' radar, and web fonts were supported, and it was kind of a really sort of big transitional time. I created this print magazine called 8 Faces, and I didn't really know much about print design. I certainly didn't know anything about running a magazine, but I ran this magazine for 8 issues, and it was really fun. It looked like this. Inside, we got designers to choose their 8 favorite typefaces, as well as do their interview. This was the favorite spreads. Most of them were designed by a friend of mine called Stefan Weyer, who lives in Cologne. And then in 2018, I think it was, I ran a Kickstarter campaign that compiled all of the magazines together and re-edited them and redesigned them and did this massive sort of 500-page book, which was fun and also very daunting. And around about the same time, this all kind of intermingled, I started a company with my friend Kia Whitaker, and we made some apps and we did some publishing. And this photo of this book that we put out is by Mark, who's running around taking photos today, and some magazine publishing. And then I went to join Typekit, which at the time they had just been acquired by Adobe, and I helped them kind of transition from what was initially just a web font service through to desktop syncing, and to sort of help them become eventually what would become Adobe fonts. And the web font side of things is very small now. It's much more about desktop syncing. But I didn't just design modal windows for them. I got to design posters and T-shirts and kind of look after their whole creative direction, which was really fun. And while at Typekit, once Eight Faces had finished, I wanted to do another magazine, and my wife, who is a writer/editor, we wanted to work together on something, and so we decided to make a lifestyle magazine called Largon, which ran for 10 issues, and it looked a little bit like this. And along with same with Eight Faces, I kind of learned how to kind of run a magazine and do writing and editing and sort of manage a team, and that was really fun. And invest in lots of nice, thick, heavy print stocks and things like that. After that, we did some books, a collaboration with Attaché Travel, and then I went to do a bunch of things with creative direction for a coffee company and some packaging design, stuff like that. Had a brief tenure of being burnt out with design, and I went to go and become director of editorial for a retail startup in Dallas. But that was actually a big mistake, and then I freaked out. And then my friend Frank, who works for ClearScore, who are like a fintech company in London, kind of pulled me in to do some creative direction for them, and I had a hand in sort of commissioning a bespoke typeface from DS Type in Portugal, which was really fun. Alongside all of that, I've sort of maintained a sort of semi-career as a musician. I do put out a lot of electronic music as other form. This is me finding my debut 12-inch in Hardwax in Berlin, which was a really, really nice moment for me. Just trying to throw in some German references for you there. And this is the label that I founded to kind of, as well as release music, to play around with design that I wouldn't get a chance to do in other parts of my work life. I do some label design for some friends who run a label in Berlin called Unterwegs. And then while that was going on, I pitched an idea to Google Fonts that would kind of be a new take on some workshops that I've been teaching, and to try and create an online education resource. And that became part of Google Fonts, and it's called Google Fonts Knowledge. And for some reason, I have completely forgotten to put the URL on there. But if you go to fonts.google.com, Knowledge is in the top nav. And I wrote and curated most of the content that is on there, and I'm going to show you some of that today. Just briefly, recently-ish, I've been doing some label design for an old-school techno guy called Luke Slater, and so I've become good friends with him, and then sent him some of my music. And then I found out recently that he played it in Berghain on New Year's Eve, which was really, really awesome. That was a lovely thing to see. Trying to throw in some German references here, but maybe talking about Berlin things in Freiburg is like people talking about London things in Bristol. I don't know. Anyway, I've got another talk where I talk about this kind of messy mix of how you shouldn't worry about following a linear career path because it's actually all a mess, and embrace the chaos and this kind of thing. If anyone wants to talk to me about that over a beer, let me know. I'm currently writing, actually no, that's not true. I've written a book, and I'm designing it at the moment, called Universal Principles of Typography. It's going to be out next spring, published by Quarto. I have the final deadline for all of the finished design files, all the illustration, everything typeset on Tuesday. So if you happen across me tomorrow in a cafe looking panicked, that's why. Okay, let's get on with the first thing, OpenType. As I mentioned, I've been talking about this for ages, going on and on and on, but I think it's really important to talk about still because OpenType has the power to really allow us to express ourselves much more with typography, and predominantly that is around the idea of alternates. So there are a few ways that alternates kind of manifest themselves through OpenType. So for instance, if we look at the example at the top right there, where it says fizzy gummies, Brie, the typeface by Type Together, very well-known typeface, has all these kind of funky Zs and Ys and Gs and stuff like that in there, which is great for maybe a logo. But if you want to use it for body type, then maybe you want to tone down some of that kind of character or personality. And then you can do that by using a stylistic set, which actually kind of gives you a sort of more formal Zs, more formal Ys, as you can see there. The one in the middle, this is Neighbor, a recently released typeface by PS Type. And that is full of alternates. And the way that those stylistic sets work is that they really quite radically change the character or personality of the typeface by changing those letter forms. You see, you've got this kind of like crazy geometric stuff going on, these wider characters as well. So you can actually do quite a lot with it. So if you're thinking about using type for a logo and then expanding that into sort of a wider branding system, these things are really useful to have in there. The chicken text, so here you've got the first one at the top is just without anything turned on. The second one down, you've got a discretionary ligature for the CH. And that looks lovely and everything, but you can see it starts to kind of nearly clash with the dot of the I. So the third one, you can see that the I actually has contextual alternates turned on. So the contextual alternates basically look at a sequence of glyphs and say, hey, if this one is here, we're going to swap this out for this one. A little bit like ligatures, but instead of combining characters into one glyph, they still remain separate, but it just kind of looks, again, at the sequence and optimizes the type for that. Sometimes there are loads of alternates. This is a typeface by Laura Worthington, who does loads and loads of sort of script or calligraphic typefaces. This one's got 11 swash characters for the A that I was using to illustrate the book the other day. And you can see this starts to get you towards moving away from type looking like type and looking a little bit more like custom lettering. Now, fractions might be perhaps not so visually exciting as the swashes, etc., but if you were setting type on a recipe website, you can really drastically improve the readability of the content by using, say, proper fractions for ingredients, for instance. Ligatures might seem obvious. They're probably the way that most of us encounter OpenType first of all. You know, FI, FL, FF, all this kind of thing, which you can see here. And then the ones in sort of the middle at the top, you've got some discretionary ligatures. That's all well and good. But then have a look at this one here, where it says checking account and all these down here. So this is a typeface called Changing by Pintasilgo Prince, and it is amazing. It's got these interlocking characters, and it has so many ligatures. That's not even all of them that you can see there, but so many discretionary ligs that once you start to employ them, suddenly you've got type not really looking like type anymore. So if you compare the smaller checking account to the larger one, you can see not only are they different, but importantly, you're getting less repetition in the characters. So the C's are all looking pretty different. You know, the N's are all looking really different. Back on the other side of things, perhaps not quite so visually exciting, but certainly from a technical standpoint, way more useful, is using the correct figures. So in most fonts, there should ideally be 4 types of figures or numerals. And starting from the top, you've got proportional lining figures. So these are where they are kind of have sort of about the same, most of the time about cap height. So they kind of look like uppercase. They all have different widths, so they're proportional, much like any other character. Next one down, you have old-style proportional figures. And what they look like is much more like lowercase characters. So if you have some copy that has a bunch of figures within the copy, within the running text, it can be useful to turn them on instead. You might be familiar with them as they're the defaults in Georgia, for instance. The next ones down are the same, but tabular. So if you have tabular data and you need figures to line up in a table, as the name suggests, then they're really useful to turn on. So if they do exist in the typeface, in the design, and they do exist in the actual font files that you're working with, then they are really useful to employ. Small caps allow us to stop shouting at our reader. So if we have text that has a lot of acronyms in it, rather than appearing to sort of shout, a little bit like when we have the larger numbers, you can kind of use small caps to make them not stand out quite as much. And the other important thing with small caps is that they're usually spaced a little bit more generously. If they're not, it's almost always good to add a little bit of tracking, so a little bit of letter spacing in there, just to let them breathe a little bit more. I talked a little bit about stylistic sets already. This is Degular, the typeface from Ono Typeco, which I'm using in the book. And this has stylistic sets. You can see here they've got names like single story A, single story G. This is useful. A lot of type designers will just name their stylistic sets like SSO1, SSO2, which is all well and good, but it's really nice to actually have some descriptive names in there. And I think the Jesus T is an especially good one when it comes to stylistic set naming. Right. CSS. This is, after all, a web conference about the web, and I'm doing a talk about web types, so it's about time I showed some CSS. Sorry, that was not a dramatic pause, just a genuine break. So OpenType, when it comes to OpenType and implementing that in CSS, weirdly, not that much has changed. So to talk you through this super quickly, in each of these, the top line is the sort of so-called low-level setting that we use to implement it today. The second line is the higher-level setting that allows us to have more control, but is not as widely supported in browsers. There's quite a lot of variance there. Now, I quite like the low-level setting because it's got these really handy 4-character codes that are fairly easy to remember, and they're still fairly descriptive to talk about what they turn on or off. But unfortunately, because they're low-level, you have to do some sort of jiggery-pokery to kind of get around this big thing, which is the inheritance problem, which I'm going to go into in a minute. We could be prudent and do something like this, where we use the high-level setting first, and then wrap the use the low-level setting first, and then wrap the more future-facing stuff in an @supports block. But I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail in a sec. So, optical size. Out of interest, who here has experimented with fonts that have different optical sizes? There's no wrong answer. I'm just genuinely interested to know who's familiar with this stuff. Cool. OK. All right. So a few, but not too many. So optical size is great, and it's one of those things that's been overlooked for a really long time. So back in the day with metal type and wood type, if you wanted to set something at a different font size, you would physically go and get a different piece of type. If anyone's done any letterpress printing, you'll be familiar with this. Grab a little piece of type, and set some type with that. Now, because they were physically different pieces, the way they were made built in all these kind of slight tweaks to the design for the size. So if you're using one at, say, 8-point versus one at, say, 30-point, they're physically different blocks, and there's going to be more contrast, perhaps, in the larger ones. They're going to kind of have maybe be a bit more expressive in terms of their personality. Now, this kind of went away once photo typesetting and digital typesetting came along, and it's only recently that we've started to get back to that a little bit. So if you have a look, just to kind of take you through this, if you look at the word karate at the top, I've set it on the left, all at the same size, but with 3 different optical styles. This is a typeface called Curios by Aerotype. And then on the right, kind of set it more at its intended size. So you're using the display optical size at the top, right down to the body optical size at the bottom. Now, you can see the word optics here. We've got Degular, and we've got the display size at the top, the kind of normal one in the middle, and then the text one at the bottom. And here you can see like exaggerated ink traps. There's more generous spacing, this kind of thing. Now, optical size is cool because it's all about thinking about what size your type is meant to be read at and making sure you're optimizing it for that. So Figma has this built in as well, fairly recently. In the optical size is turned on by default. You can see this little checkbox. If you've got a variable font that has an optical size axis, and I'm going to delve into variable fonts in a sec, that's turned on by default, and you can start to play with it. And what it will do is it will map the font size value to the optical size value. And so it will sort of follow the font size, in theory, and set it at the appropriate optical size. If you turn that off, you can then start to play with it separately. So here I've dragged that down to be the optical size value of 6. Now, that's really important if you want to have that extra little bit of control over your type. It might be that at certain sizes you feel that optical size isn't quite right for that. There might be graphics you're producing where it's not really 6-point. It's actually ends up being exported at the equivalent of, say, 30 points. So you can tweak all that stuff. InDesign has that turned on by default as well, although weirdly it's under preferences. I don't know why they did that. It's not under character styles or paragraph styles under preferences, but there you go. So this is also turned on by default in a lot of modern browsers. And you can turn this off and then set your own optical size as well if you want to. And again, there is a potential inheritance problem there, which I'm going to go to in a minute. So grade. Let's talk about grade quickly. Who here, again, no wrong answers, who is familiar with grade as a concept? Who's worked with grade in fonts before? Not many people, not many people. Okay, that's good to know, because I think especially in the type world, especially, you know, Google Fonts, Adobe Fonts would get very much into this, thinking that everyone's familiar with all these concepts, and it's really good to know how that is actually in use. So grade is sort of a little bit, on the face of it, seems a bit like weight. And in a way, it's actually sort of a bit more like multiplexed typefaces, which is where you change the weight, and in a multiplex typeface, it doesn't take up any more horizontal space, so the width doesn't change. So it's great for interactions. You can see the top example doesn't really work, because once something is hovered or selected, it nudges all the other buttons over, whereas the bottom, the layout is retained. Grade is about maintaining consistency. Here you can see Roboto Flex, which has a grade axis. It's a variable font. When we did the magazine, we had, as you can see here, some titles, some text, dark text on a light background. And on some pages, light text on a dark background. Now in print, when you print onto dark colors onto light background, i.e. paper, you have the ink sits there. Now if you have white text on a dark background, what's happening is that you're leaving the paper intact, and that the ink around it is kind of bleeding into that, and so usually reduces the thickness of the letter forms a little. So what we did there is use a different grade to account for that. And the idea of grade comes from sort of different paper stocks, different printing methods, where you might have, say, a glossy insert in a newspaper magazine, and you're trying to match the overall typographic color between the lower quality newspaper and the insert. So grade can be a great way of maintaining consistency. If we're working on the web, which is what we're talking about today, dark mode is all the rage. There's a great article on CSS Tricks about using grade to do that with dark mode, because the opposite is true on screen, where light text on dark starts to kind of bloat out, starts to kind of glow. So if you can use grade axis within a variable font, then you get a little bit of extra control. And you might say, oh, never mind, I switched to dark mode, it doesn't matter. But what if you had, say, a dark background with light text, and maybe you had a little box out that was a white box with some dark text on there? To maintain consistency across them, you could use grade to tweak them slightly. Using some custom CSS properties, this is the CSS recommended by the article. I'll go into this in a bit more in detail. Right, who's still with me? Let's take a brief break to look at my dog. This is our new dog. We have two dogs. This is Benji, who's been with us for a couple of months. He's a rescue from Cyprus. And we think he maybe was raised by cats on the streets of Cyprus, because he's pretty convinced that he's a cat. This is him and one of my daughters in my office. Right. OK, back into it. Variable fonts. I've got 12 minutes. Oh, God. OK. Variable fonts are great. Who here has played with variable fonts? A few more people. OK, cool. Variable fonts are awesome. And I forgot to add the title into this slide. Let's just glance over that. So people think about variable fonts as manipulating weight and width and slant, etc., and that's fine. They're the so-called registered axes. But actually, any parameter, any part of a typeface's design can be turned into a variable axis, depending on, I mean, it's completely up to the type designer, but they can do it. So here you have, in Ono's Chi, you have the yeast and the gravity axes doing kind of crazy things there. And you can see that as you start to manipulate both at the same time, you get some really interesting things going on. This, at the bottom, was the typeface called Climate Change that was commissioned by Helsinki, a Finnish newspaper I can't remember the title of, but based on data around melting ice caps, where the years into the future, the type would degrade to represent the amount that they had melted. There's some pretty wild stuff out there, but anything can be a variable axis, which is quite exciting. If you want a bit of a primer for variable fonts and you haven't looked into them yet, I wrote this when we launched Google Fonts Knowledge, which is a fairly decent, hopefully, primer on that. The key thing here is that if you want to get into using variable fonts, there are these 5 registered axes that have been mapped to existing CSS attributes. So you don't really have to do anything fancy at all. If you want to manipulate weight, for instance, you can just go in there and just start changing the values. So whereas before we might have had, I don't know, font weight 400 for regular, 700 for bold, you can have anything in between. And you can still use all your existing CSS, except you get to be more specific with your numbers. That's a really nice, easy way to start dealing with it. However, there is this inheritance problem, which I've now mentioned a couple of times. Let's get into it. So Roel Niskins has a really great, actually a couple of really great articles on his website about this. He talks about it from a variable font perspective, but also it applies to when we're using OpenType, using font feature settings. So if you have a look at the screen grab at the top, what's happening here, what's going wrong, is that he's using font variation settings to set a different weight for all of that type, and then a different slant for the text that says with water. Now, unfortunately, with font variation settings, that slant is going to override the weight setting, which is why you end up with that looking way too thin. And the way to get around this is to redeclare everything again. So here, for instance, we're setting small caps off and stylistic set 1 off, and then for this particular div, we're turning stylistic set 1 on. But you can see how very, very easily that would start to become quite unruly once you have a big site, or maybe you're using multiple variable font axes. So his suggested way around that is to start using CSS custom properties or CSS variables, where it looks a little bit more complex to begin with, but you've got it on there, and then once it's set up, you can see how easy it is when you come down to that div, and then imagine any other element where you can very quickly just turn something on or off again. I've got not much time, so I'm going to skip through it, but yeah, I thoroughly recommend having a look at his blog posts about that. Very, very useful. And this does apply to when we're turning OpenType features on as well, with font feature settings as well. OK, I don't have enough time to talk about color fonts and layer fonts, but if you do want to talk to me about that, let's grab a beer and geek out about that. More than happy to. Let's now take a little bit of a sidestep and talk about line height, because line height is nothing to do with, it's not a new feature, but I feel like it's something that trips us up so much when we're trying to set decent type on the web. First things first, a lot of folks don't realize that the metrics inside a font, that is, where your ascender height is, where your cap height is, X height, et cetera, varies massively because the type designer can put them anywhere. Anywhere. It does not matter. You have the invisible box that surrounds each glyph called the M-square, and within that, your X height, your baseline, they can sit wherever they want. There's no hard and fast rules saying why that is. And this is why when you try and set some type, so lovely body type, it's all beautiful, and then you get a nice a pull quote next to it, say, or some other typographic element, and you try and pair a different typeface, or you just decide to swap it out, suddenly you'll find that, hang on, the alignment's off, like it's jumping around. It should be aligned, but now it's slightly over there. Or hang on a minute, this looks slightly larger than the other font. Why is that? It's all because of the internal metrics and the way that everything sits in the M-square. This is actually an exaggerated version, but just here you can see 3 different fonts. The baselines are just physically in different positions, and so this is going to cause us trouble when pairing type. Calculating line height is just hard. This example here is kind of ideally where we want it to be. So to kind of get it looking actually visually aligned, where we've got 20 pixels here and 10 pixels there, and it's all nice and balanced, we actually have to do some crazy kind of weird working out stuff here, because there's all this white space contained within these text boxes that is kind of sort of unknowable. Fonts with equal metrics can help out here. So this is Martian Grotesque and Martian Mono by Evil Martians, where they're trying to kind of help out by positioning things so that when you have a design system, especially built around interaction, you can have things that line up with icons and stuff like that in the middle. I probably don't need to talk about design systems to this crowd, but type is the foundation of any good design system, and a scale is a very key part of that. So let's talk about that in a sec. Before I jump off there, there is this new proposal in CSS called text box trim that was until recently referred to as leading trim. This is actually implemented in Figma already, where it will strip off the white space inside a text box, so you can actually start to measure from your cap height, from your X height, from your baseline. All those things that we've been kind of hacking our way around, you can actually now do in Figma. Now, whether or not it gets implemented in CSS tomorrow is almost by the by. I feel like personally, when I'm in Figma designing stuff, I feel more confident knowing that this is X amount of pixels away from the other one just by setting that. So if you haven't tried that out yet, please do. This is the proposed CSS for what that will look like when it's adopted. Right, fluid type scales. Let's try and fit this one in. So let's talk about scales quickly. People are very opinionated about scales, and people will tell you lots of grand theories about how you should adopt musical theory into these and stuff. To be honest, it doesn't really matter. Controversial. A scale can be anything. It can be absolutely anything. You could just double it if you want. It doesn't really matter. A scale is about creating a relationship between the type size you've got currently and the type size above it and the size below. Now, if you don't have a scale, and you imagine the line, it's just kind of jumping around like crazy. Whereas if you have a scale, you can see here the major third one is kind of, you see that line in there. The golden ratio, the line is over here, but it's still a line. Now, what's happening here is that you have a scale, the golden ratio, where the contrast between each type size is greater. So this can be really good if you're trying to say, hey, I want to have massive headings. I think it's going to look really cool to have massive headings and then much smaller body text. Depends on the context, of course. Again, it doesn't matter. Choose a scale and stick with it. But the real future is in fluid type scales. So a lot of folks have done some writing about this, but perhaps the best way that I've seen this articulated is through a couple of guys from Clearleft Agency who have got a website called utopia.fyi, and it is really useful. What you effectively do, and the numbers are kind of the sequence of things here. So number one, you go to the site. Number two, you set the minimum width of your smallest viewport and your biggest viewport. Then you set the font size that's going to appear on your sort of body text for the small viewport and for the big viewport, and then the type scale you want to use for both. Now, the important thing is that if you imagine a mobile device, you don't necessarily want to have really massive headings compared to your body text, because it's just going to be too much for that size screen. But maybe once you get to desktop, nice big like 27-inch iMac, it's okay to have a really high contrast scale. Now, what the fluid type scales do is you define two scales, two extremes of the spectrum, and then that uses the existing smarts built into the browser to just work out all that stuff in between, and you don't have to worry about it. So, to show you, this is what it spits out. This is one that I'm using for my redesign of my blog at the moment. So you get these variables at the end, or the CSS custom properties, which, I don't know what that means. It's just, whatever, that's cool. It's pretty complex, but it's fine. Just put it in my variables CSS file. And then you implement it literally just by adding these in. So I've got type scale step 0 for my body, step 5 for H1, step 3 for H2. Now, when it came to when I was redesigning my site, I was looking at these, and I was like, yeah, cool, I've got this scale, it's great, it's all well and good. And then I realized that, actually, you know what? The contrast isn't working. I want my headings to be that little bit bigger for the really big display. Or maybe I want my headings to be not too much bigger for the small display. And the awesome thing is, I don't have to touch any of this code. I just go into that CSS file where I've got my variables, and I just go back to Utopia FYI, change the scale, copy the code out, paste it right in. It's amazing. I don't have to touch any of my main CSS. I can just go into the variables and just paste in this whole thing again, and not even worry about what it means. And all of this stuff just updates. So it's just so future-proof. You can change your mind at any point. You could switch to a new scale. You could switch to 2 new scales. It doesn't matter. And the cool thing is that the browser uses its inbuilt smarts to make all of those changes for you. You don't have to worry about it. Right, takeaways. Nearly there. So, it's very simple. Web typography, there's loads to talk about, but I've tried to narrow it down to 6 key things that I would just feel very passionate about, and I feel they can help us improve what we're doing with type on the web. So use open type features if they exist in your font. And it is important to state that just because something exists in the type design, maybe you've seen it on a type specimen, something like that, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's in the actual font files you're using. So the font files might be different if they're coming from a different service, or maybe some foundries might sell like a pro or a light version. That doesn't really happen much these days, but it's possible. Use optical sizes if they exist in your font, because you are then thinking about how the reader is actually going to see that text at that particular size. Really, really useful. Use grades if they exist in your font. There aren't many fonts that right now that have lots of different grades. There aren't that many variable fonts that have a grade access, but if it does exist, if you're doing stuff with light and dark modules, you're working with dark mode, can be really handy to think about that. And use variable fonts because it goes way beyond just being sort of fussy about exactly how bold you want something to be. That's kind of the very sort of simple way of looking at variable fonts. There is loads more opportunity there, especially if you're doing some logo work or anything where you would otherwise have to maybe outline the type and make some kind of changes yourself. And use all of the above to help you choose your fonts. So it's really hard choosing fonts. It's really hard. There's so many things to consider. And I think it's really useful to have some guardrails. So use all of that stuff to help you narrow down your selections. Be aware of the issues that line height causes. There's no immediate solution here, but it's more about just understanding the M-square, about understanding the metrics, and just thinking about when you're pairing type, when you're combining different typographic elements, what might be kind of causing you headaches in your design system. And use fluid type scales. Use a scale, obviously. I think everyone knows that by now. But definitely use fluid type scales as a way of taking out a lot of that guesswork and taking out just a lot of the effort as well, to let the browser do the smart stuff for you. And again, just to conclude, web typography has grown up. We're so lucky. You know, I was here 10 years ago talking about OpenType, and lots of stuff where we were still kind of hacking things together. But now it's so good. It's in such a good place. Now we're at a point where we can just focus our efforts on enhancing what's there. And there are loads of great tools out there to do that. So it's all about enhancement. I mentioned choosing fonts. I wrote this piece for Google Fonts about choosing fonts, and there is a sort of supplementary GitHub that's called a checklist for choosing type. I've kind of ended up using this myself a lot for different projects. There's sort of 4 steps with some sub-steps about how to choose type, and then sort of from that, how to choose the fonts specifically for that type. Hopefully that might prove useful if you're faced with kind of a blank canvas and don't know where to start. Lastly, we just don't have any excuse. We're not using linotype machines. We're not having to pick out little pieces of metal type and to make all of these kind of macro decisions in tiny amounts of time. We've got it really easy. So this is why we need to just focus on making it as good as it possibly can be. And I feel like there are a lot of examples on the web where we as web folks are not quite pushing typography as far as it can go. As I mentioned, I'm finishing this book. I've got to finish it by Tuesday. That's going to come out in spring next year. I'm also teaching a workshop for Smashing at the middle of next month. I set over five days, 5 lots of 2-hour sessions. Did one in March, lots of fun. Shout out to David, who's here. And yeah, so if you fancy more of this stuff in detail, be sure to have a look at that. I run a newsletter called Typographic and Sporadic. It is typographic in nature and sporadic in its delivery. So if you like that kind of thing, please do sign up. I'm in the process of getting a proper sign-up form on my website, but for now it's that buttondown.email address. And I'm over, hopefully not too far over. Thank you very much for listening. Much appreciated.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Elliot. So join me for a short conversation. Well, not very short. We have 10 minutes. We have quite a number of questions.
Oh, okay. Should I sit down?
Yeah.
Okay.
Feel like home here. You're not going anywhere, I think.
Okay.
So one question that often comes up with fonts, right? And this is something that I think many of us have experienced. That's when we kind of load a web font on a page, we often have these jumps between the fallback font and the web font. And Sasha is wondering, one big struggle when optimizing for layout shifts is text jumping after a font loads. Do you have any good techniques to configure a web-safe font to match as close as possible to the to-be-loaded font?
To be totally honest, I've almost kind of given up on this in that if you have there is a lot of, like, Richard Rutter did a lot of work on this with having, using font stretch to kind of try and use a fallback font that would effectively take up roughly the same amount of space that the actual web font would. I think it's a lot of trouble to go to. Now that we've got the font display property, you can kind of just whereas before we had to sort of hack this in the past, you can now kind of just set to use to at least use the fallback font to begin with. So we're kind of getting rid of flash of invisible text. I think it's okay to have that unstyled text. I mean, I know I totally get the jump can be extreme if you were to use, say, like a very highly condensed font, for instance, and then you know everything is going to reflow differently. I personally have kind of, I guess, sort of become okay with it. I mean, that is with the caveat that I think it's super important to still try and be mindful of the bandwidth that web fonts take up as well, and to make sure that you're not loading, you know, a load of variable fonts, sorry, a load of web fonts that are going to take a long time to load. So ideally, you're minimizing that tiny bit of time where it's going to load in system fonts.
Yeah, I think one of the common things that I see teams doing is whenever it comes to web fonts, somebody would just get Roboto Flex or something and then put it on or Open Sans, right? And it would just put it on the page, but you don't need all of the characters, right?
Yeah, you could use a Unicode range to just sort of load the essentials, and then maybe some won't be some will be rendered in the fallback system font, but then you can, once it's loaded, then kind of have the full set in there. So, yeah. I mean, that is one of the advantages of variable fonts as well, and that if you're using, this is a huge sweeping generalization, but if you're using sort of 3 to 4 plus weights or styles, that typically a variable font will be more performant. So yes, a variable font file is going to be bigger than, you know, if you're only using one weight. But if, again, yeah, sort of 3 to 4 plus, it's probably going to pay for you to use a variable font, even if you're not doing anything that like exciting with it. You're just switching out for a bold and a regular, etc.
Right, right. Patrick is wondering, some fonts look different in Figma than in the browser, or in Adobe XD and so on, right? Is there a way to adjust the font in the browser with CSS, for example, so that it matches a bit more?
I think a lot of this is down to, I mean, it's hard. I think, I'd be interested to know if they if it's actually measuring differently. I mean, there are so many things that work with the browser where if you're loading something that's sized in pixels, in theory should be the same. Obviously, if you're sizing in rems and ems, there's going to be some slight variation there. I think the biggest times where you have a font look bigger somewhere is when its metrics are different. So, for instance, if you were to have say a system font that is, so let's think of something like, say Times New Roman, where you're going to have the X height smaller than something like Verdana or a web font like, say, Open Sans or Noto. That's when you're really going to notice that shift, because the X height is so much bigger in another font. It optically looks larger, even though it's actually not larger. In terms of going from Figma to the browser, I'm not sure what's at play there. I mean, in theory, like, if there's some, yeah, I'm not sure what other settings would be
I guess
at work there.
That's just very often what you end up with is, it seems like it's similar in Miro as well. It seems like it's different. So if you just, let's say, render an HTML page in a particular web font, then compared to what it looks like in, if it's drawn with Canvas, it seems like maybe it's different. I can't tell, I mean,
there's like
finger at it,
rendering engine stuff going on there as well, and potential like browser defaults that perhaps have not been reset and stuff like that as well.
Yeah. I also kind of like this idea in general to be a bit more intentional with typefaces. I think what I really like is the fact that there was at some point, I think maybe 2-3 years ago, maybe even more than that, Braille Institute came up with Atkinson Hyperlegible.
Atkinson Hyperlegible, yeah,
right?
That's it.
And I think it's interesting that I would love to see, in like video players, for example, embedding some sort of a feature in settings saying, well, you can choose a larger font, like you do with video players sometimes,
yes.
like larger font size for subtitles, smaller and so on, but also maybe dyslexic font. Yeah. That'd be lovely to see.
And there's loads of, I mean, I haven't touched on it at all in these slides, but there is it's really important to be looking at so many fonts, like an outrageous number of typefaces. You know, you have, let's say, a B and a D, a lowercase b and a lowercase d, and they're just flipped, basically. They're just mirrored. Same with a P and a Q, for instance. Whereas if the type designer is really paying attention to legibility and to readability, they are going to make sure that there is a subtle difference there. So there'll be, I mean, I'm not going to describe it now. I'm going to do a terrible job of describing something so visual, but that they wouldn't merely be mirrored characters, that they would be distinct in some way. And that can really be a huge aid. And again, when we're choosing type, to be considering things like that as well, you know, not just the technical side of things, but actually thinking about, is there something that's actually going to help someone who's perhaps dyslexic or has something else where, you know, we need to kind of think about characters being very, very easily distinguished from one another.
Right. There is also this interesting, I guess, metaphor when it comes to picking or choosing typefaces, where a friend of mine at some point told me that, you know, if you go to a restaurant, a sommelier would pick a wine based on the meal that you have. And so sometimes he would say, well, if you want to pair your typefaces best, you go to a type foundry that has one serif, one sans serif, and you're going to try to match them because they're coming from the same origin, so to say.
Was that friend me? Did I say that?
Could be. I don't know, because it could be. I don't know. Were you saying that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great kind of easy hack to kind of,
right.
Because it's not just the, so there's this idea, Jessica Hirsch talks about this a lot, the idea of like the artist's hand. So, you know, an artist draws an apple one way and then does another painting, and there are going to be certain inbuilt similarities, and it's the same thing with type. That there are going to be elements of the way that the characters are drawn that are going to be shared amongst the same typefaces from the same type designer, but also technically, like in terms of where metrics sit in fonts, are more likely, it's a generalization, but more likely to be shared when they're coming from the same type designer or perhaps the same type foundry. So it's a sweeping generalization, but it's a little bit of a hack for pairing stuff, for sure.
Right. I also remember maybe like many years ago, I was using 2006, I think, was the last time I was using Windows. And I'm just a story. I'm not trying to be judgmental here. And I remember when I was always go to Safari, because Safari had this smoothness around the type. Right?
Yeah, the font smoothing. Yeah.
Yes, and I think I'm wondering, this is a question that came from Fabian just now. What's your take, I don't know if it's related, what's your take on anti-aliasing in the browser? This often fixes the discrepancy between Figma and the browser, but I'm not sure about accessibility.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually, because that is not something, I remember like back in the day, like 10 years ago, that was definitely a thing, like everyone was turning on WebKit font smoothing to make it all look really nice. As far as I know, that caused some other knock-on issues, which I feel like we kind of knocked on the head to kind of get around that. Like I don't manually use that these days. That's not to say that it's something you shouldn't do. But yeah, I seem to, when that was more of a thing, that was causing other issues with rendering. So I think that was generally kind of not recommended.
Okay.
But I must hold my hands up as that could be different at the moment.
Okay. And then we are running out of time. But the last question I do have to ask, and we didn't speak about your music career, but a question I always bring up because it's so much fun. Should we be expecting you to come to Berghain in Berlin anytime soon?
Well, I haven't been invited yet, but my music's been played there, so I'm there in spirit.
Okay, so there is hope, I would say.
There's hope.
All right, well, with this in mind, thank you so much for being with us, Elliot.
Thank you, Viti. Thanks, everyone.